Okay, so I hope you're enjoying this little journey that Steve and I are on at the moment. And in the previous video, if you haven't watched it, go back to it. Steve was really looking at the history of the development of philosophy, worldviews and cultures, and how really we've got to the point in our society, on planet Earth, if you like, where we have two fundamentally different worldviews, if you like, that are kind of almost operating in parallel but have no real interaction with one another, namely postmodernism and a very kind of, I don't know what you'd call sciencey type worldview. And there seems to be no way to cross that gap between them. So in this second part, in this second video, Steve's actually going to present what he feels is hopefully, a solution towards that, and that involves removing a jumper because we're going to generate a lot of heat here. So without more ado, Steve, before I completely lose it, would you like to kind of outline your approach?
Yeah, I'm not sure how. I mean, I'm not sure whether I'll go through every step. I might just give us a rough outline, because I think going through every step might be get a bit sort of, complicated at some point. But basically, I suppose, so what I started out with was thinking, okay, well, clearly, there must be a kind of a way the world is. And a perspective you can hold that will tell you why maths works and science works, and also why and nevertheless that the mind is actively kind of engaged in shaping, the information we get in and so on. Because it seems to me that each of those was quite incontrovertibly true, but we didn't know what that perspective was.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm going to spanner in the works here a little bit for you, because obviously this sort of question was at the beginning of the 20th century very much being grappled with by the precursors to the quantum mechanical revolution.
Right.
But they were looking at it from the perspective of the fact that you had this very kind of deterministic worldview, and there were things that were contradicting it, which didn't make sense.
Right.
And so you ended up with this great delving into and the emergence of quantum mechanics, which arguably does go some way towards
well, it might well do.
that problem.
I don't know much about quantum mechanics. I actually used a little bit of Einstein really to help me on my way, because what I did was I sort of thought, well, I looked at what had happened in the 17th century. Basically, people had realised that Aristotle and the ancient Greeks had just got it all wrong. I mean, Aristotle was really the flavour of the month in the Middle Ages. He'd been kind of rediscovered, about sort of 400 years previously, and everyone really sort of loved Aristotle. But people realised once you get this checking coming in and science comes underway, you just have to chuck all that out. You can't see that anymore. And so what people did, really quite self-consciously, if you read the philosophy of around that time, there's a real sense of we're beginning again here. We're just chucking all this stuff out. Just looking, and basically they had certain fixed points. The whole sort of sciencey thing, that was really important, and sort of Newton and all that stuff. And so basically they were saying, well, how to have a worldview, how to have a way of understanding reality, and it went through everything, it went through politics and all sorts of things, so that Newton and this new scientific method just sits very comfortably as part of that. So that was really what they were doing. So they knew where they wanted to end up. They wanted to end up with a worldview that said, Newton, science, obviously, that's what we want to do, that's the way we want to go. And that's the way they kind of went about it. And so I was sort of thinking, well, is there anything that we have that doesn't sit very comfortably in our worldview? And one of the things I was aware of was having heard about Einstein's relativity theories and relativistic effects. And as something accelerates towards the speed of light, it gets shorter, its mass gets heavier, time processes slow down, all this sort of thing, relative to observers and this sort of thing, which just seemed to me to be bizarre. And I realised that it was because basically our cultural heritage comes from the sort of philosophers of the 17th century. I mean, in a broad sense, that meant that I was very comfortable with Newton. So when somebody said about Newton, when learning physics at school, you hear Newton, of course, that's all very obvious. And when someone talks about Einstein, you think, well, that sounds a bit weird. And so I set myself to think, okay, well, what if you had a worldview which was such that if someone gave you the choice between Newton and Einstein, you'd say, well, Newton's certainly a bit weird. Yeah, probably Einstein. You see what I mean? Now it's
Interesting approach.
Yeah, well, it's because and also obviously having an eye to this sort of Greek, the maths and the science and the thing as well. But that was really what I sort of started off. I thought that might be a helpful way in, and basically the thought that struck me very clearly was that all these things happen sort of relative to observers, and there's this sense that actually somehow the relationships between objects and things are affecting each other somehow. You don't just
that's
have.
Interesting.
Well, hang on. You don't just have everything separate, but actually the relationships are real in the sense they're actually having a specific effect on things. So when you write the furniture of the universe, you don't just have things, but all the relationships. Now, I don't know in what detail, but certainly this is a sort of direction of it. All the relations are real and significant and need to be there as part of what's going on. Okay? And then the more I thought about that seems to make sort of sense of, and so in a way, so the universe, from a physics point of view, seems to be that you've got, in a way, these things that through their relationship sort of there's this fabric of time and space that's constructed out of the relations between these objects, but then this fabric then sort of constrains the object. So it's a very interesting sort of symbiotic relationship between things and their relationships and the interrelationships all sort of woven in together. And then it sort of struck me that when we talk about a thing, I mean, even that's an ambiguous thing. If you have a pen, it's one thing, but then it's made up of different bits, and then different bits within that. And what we call a thing is really something that can operate as a unit in relationships with other similar kinds of things. And at different levels, like atomic level, I don't know exactly how many different significant levels of reality there are, but you get the idea that there are different interrelationships working, say, at an atomic level, than there are, because people used to say, an atom is like the model of the solar system, but now they don't say that, do they? Because that works differently. So the interrelationships work differently, and you get this picture of reality as being units in relation, behaving in certain ways, but then within that, each unit is itself a thing, it's a series of relationships, and that breaks down and breaks down and breaks down until I saw a program on the telly recently that says in the end all you get is a mathematical equation. Apparently if you go down and down and down and down, you just get nothing, which is really interesting. So you don't have at the bottom a thing that's holding it up, as it were. It just keeps on splitting up into things in relation, things in relation, things in relation, going down and down and down until there seems to be nothing left except an equation, which I thought was really interesting. So it's this idea that actually not just that you have objects and relationships, but the relationships are primary, and it's not that the relationships are all there are, because obviously there are things, but we know what a thing is by its relationships, its actual internal relationships and its potential external relationships. And then what that took me to was the thought, well, relationships can be interpreted in different ways. It's not like a thing, a camera or a chair or a dog, that's what it is. But relations and relationships and how that interrelationships can be interpreted in lots of different ways. And they can be correctly interpreted or misinterpreted. See what I mean? Mm-hmm. And a lot of what language is about giving you maps. Languages and cultures are about giving you maps of how those interrelationships work, which are not necessarily decisively deterministic, because it doesn't mean that everybody has to think like that, but they certainly guide you in certain directions so that it's very easy just to be sort of swept along with that, and that's how you'll always see things, you never think about it. But I mean, okay, to get to the quick of actually the sort of the truth bit.
I mean, you're opening up so many open loops here. This is really cool.
Okay, and just to say, the key for me, and I'm just saying this to signal that for me this is the key thing in it all. There's a little sort of theory of truth that I won't go into here, but it was that the reason why postmodernists are so anti-science, or not anti-science, that's the wrong way of putting it, but it's so easy for postmodernism to go off wrongly about science, is because basically they say everything is just sort of, determined by your culture, and that's because the view about where language and the world meet, because traditionally language and the world meet at the level of, the cat is on the mat. So that is, in a sense, language and the world are most connected. And from lots of cats on the mats, you then sort of conclude certain scientific statements, from lots of observational statements. And then from your observational statements you might go into metaphysics, which is very far back from reality. So basically, if the cat is on the mat, doesn't really connect with reality, then there's nowhere else that language connects with reality. That's what postmodernists, that's the strength of postmodernism, but that's not true, because if you think about it, so I just spent a couple of minutes saying this, the cat is on the mat. If that's not true, it's because the dog is on the mat, or the cat is under the mat, or the cat was on the mat. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. In other words, it's not, and it's not, it's sort of quite, there's something else that is true. It doesn't actually challenge that splitting the world up into cats and mats and things like that. And 10 minutes later, it might be the cat is on the mat. So it's not the sentence itself that falls, but it's just this particular usage. The cat is on the mat. Oh, no, it's gone off, so now the cat is not on the mat. See what I mean? Mm-hmm. So there's no vulnerability to the way the world... Let's say the world in itself actually wasn't... Cats and mats wasn't a proper way of chopping it up. You wouldn't get that feedback from the cat is on the mat. In other words, you'd happily go on talking about the world in that way, and the world would never say, hang on a minute, you're getting it wrong. Just through those little observation statements. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, that sort of statement is not vulnerable to the way the world is.
Okay.
But... And so traditionally, that's always been seen as the point at which language and the world are most connected.
Right.
But if you think about the world as being primarily relational, and some of those relationships are fleeting, coming and going, others are more sort of stable and long-term, such as the relationship between energy, mass, and the speed of light, for instance.
Okay, right.
Now, if you have something like E equals mc squared, for instance, well, that is something that is actually vulnerable to reality, isn't it?
Right, because you can test it.
You can test it. And and it's not just the use of the sentence that is at stake. It's not like the cat's on the mat where it's not true now, it might be in 10 minutes.
Right.
It's actually very vulnerable to, because you're saying when E equals mc squared, you're saying all sorts of things, aren't you? You're saying energy, mass, speed of light, these are sort of somehow valid or proper, appropriate, units or ways of chopping the world up, and these are the constant long-term relationships. This is the interaction between them in a sort of stable underlying basis.
That's the assumption.
And that
is
something, and that is something that you can test.
Yes.
And so, if that isn't right in reality, that can be exposed and tested. So it seems to me that that is the point where there is vulnerability of language to the world. Yeah. It's not actually at the level of the cat is on the mat, because that will never, that will never be exposed really at that level. But when you have in terms of general long-term interrelationships between certain sort of things like energy, mass, force, that is something that is vulnerable to reality. And so, if you've got these interrelationships between things, some of which are very long-term and stable, and some of which are just sort of fleeting and coming and going, and one of the things we are able to do, it seems to me that actually, if God came and said, this is the way the world is, and gave us what all those interrelationships were, we would be able to understand them. So as human beings, we are in principle able to understand what's going on. And that's where the vulnerability is, and that's where we can, that's sort of, if you like, the through which we can have some sort of assurance or hope that our worldview is grounded in reality in some way. That at least is one aspect of it, in a sort of scientific way.
Yeah, I'm with you.
So what that means is that, so if you've got the world as primarily relational, so maths, if you like, is somehow, something like, is as kind of the form, is very within which all relationships in a physical sense happen. You can't imagine a world, I can't imagine a world in which 2 add 2 is 3. I can't imagine what that would, in other words, it's just, that's the framework within which everything happens. And if you like, that's the sort of relations of I don't know how to put it exactly, but that's the kind of, which is so solid and guaranteed that you can't even imagine what it would be like. But then you've also got science, which is about which is about finding out about the solid long-term interrelationships, but which are kind of more uncertain. Because you don't know for sure that E equals mc squared, because it could be E equals 2mc squared. You don't know that. You need to test it, you need to sort of work it out, and that sort of gives us certain clues. And obviously we're dealing here only with certain kinds of knowledge, and it's not the only kind of knowledge, but certainly in terms of our understanding of the world, so talking about what reality is like and human understanding and how it all fits together. So I suppose the picture you get is that we do have, as human beings, we have the sort of plasticity about our understanding of the world. And obviously every culture has a map and a language, but particularly a sort of cultural map that will give it a picture of what's going on. That will work fine on a day-to-day basis. It may or may not correspond very deeply to reality, but that's not always what it's trying to do. But if we are concerned with what is really going on, because if we want to say do amazing things from a technological point of view, then actually one of the good things about what science does is it provides things, a way of seeing the world which is intrinsically vulnerable to testing, and therefore you can find out, well, actually, is this a sort of valid thing? So it does have that sort of, I suppose, that ultimately, in the end, potentially that sort of objective quality to it. And certainly, there is an assumption which seems to be validated, which is that underlying the reality that surrounds us, there are sort of long-term interrelationships between sort of type units like energy, mass. I don't know, you know more about it than I do. I mean, there is a sort of framework of the way that things are that is constant and stable, and which we are able to access. But in order to do that, we need to listen carefully and to do lots of testing. And once we start being bombastic and shouty, then we lose that. We need to be quiet, we need to listen and sort of see if we can discern our way through.